to talk about stand establishment, I really apply the who, what, where, when, why to this because I think it's important to understand. And this is, in my opinion, one of the things that maybe does not always get done to the fullest extent that it could. And so that's why I want to do and talk a little bit more about why and some of the details around this. So who should be doing this? I say farmers, agronomists, crop scouts. I mean, the list really could go on. But doing stand assessments, if I think from a retail perspective, is the ability to start to be able to decipher, what was the stand, as it came out of the ground. Were there seed issues? Were there planter issues? Were there those types of things? Or did we have seedling diseases? Or hopefully we're not looking at herbicide injury at this point of the game on the early side of this, but we possibly could have some herbicide injury. But doing those stand assessments gives us a starting point for the growing season as well. So that way, when you get out there into the early, I'll say the early to mid, so V5, 6, 7, 8 in corn, as we get out into the V4 to R1 staging on soybeans, if we do have plant injury, we have a knowledge of where that plant was, how many plants we had out there, what was the stand looking like before we ran into a stressor of any type there. Okay, so there is some important aspects of doing that. So the what aspect of this is that, one, what we're really wanting to do is to assess what we have for plant density out there, plant population or stand count, another terminology there. We want to look at emergence uniformity and seedling vigor, and I'm going to walk through these a little bit more in detail with you here momentarily too. And then we want to be able to identify, if we don't have the stand density, we don't have uniform emergence, we want to dig into why we don't have that. So, what are the anomalies that we're seeing? What was the seed depth? Are there root growth issues? Is there sidewall compaction? Things like that. Okay, so we can really dive into that. The time frame that I like to start doing this is at the emergence to V3 stage in both corn and soybeans. So emergence is probably a little bit on the early side, but it really does start to be able to decipher, what were the planter configurations, what was the soil conditions at and following planting versus some of the insect and disease things that might be a little bit easier to see once you get out to the V1, V2, V3 stages. So we can do it as early as emergence, but a lot of times it's easier to do kind of at that V1, V2, V3. So where I am a big proponent of, we should be doing it in every field because every field got planted into different conditions. We're maybe using different seed. We may have different management from one field to the next. So every field we should be looking at. We should be especially looking at fields that we know we have suspected problems. So every year I go out and I try to monitor, when did we have a rain and which fields got planted the first, field planted, so to speak, after those rains. When did we get back in? Because those fields tend to have some stand establishment problems associated with sidewall compaction or maybe even poor seed placement just because of the soil being a little wetter. We want to look at good spots and bad spots within fields. My recommendation is to kind of look, at this kind of like we would for zone sampling, kind of, break the field up into 10-acre sections and do a stand establishment once or twice within a 10-acre section and then do that across the field. Again, what we're really trying to do here is to get a good, accurate representation of what type of stands we have out in those fields. And then we're really starting to understand or be able to see and be able to decipher, is it planter performance? Is there operator performance issues? What were the soil conditions? And did we have some things, whether it was too cold, too wet, too dry, from that time frame where we were getting germination and emergence occurring? Did we have biotic interference, is how I've termed it here, but do we have insects that are eating the seed or cutting those seminal and radical roots, or even clipping the mesocotyl or the shoot, right? Do we have seedling disease pressure that's causing plants not to have the same vigor, or possibly even be killing the plant or the seed? And then the last one there is really looking at crop performance. This part of it, what I'm thinking about is twofold. One is that we can use the fields that have, some challenges, I'll call them, because of sidewall compaction or whatever else. We can use those fields as sentinel plots to kind of give us an indicator if we have wet weather, dry weather. Those fields are already stressed, and so they're going to maybe show stresses that may be affecting other fields into the future. So they may show those stresses first. The other thing is what you've done, if you do a good stand assessment early in the year, you've now given the farmer 9 to 12 months to work on planter performance or operator performance, or to improve for next year. So that gives them the ability to adjust, whether they need to be replacing parts on the planter, whether they just need to maintain it differently or have it set up differently, whether they need to reconsider how they've got, what speed that they're going through the field, things like that. So there are a lot of reasons why we want to be doing these stand assessments, because it can help start to decipher what we're seeing later in the year and improve things for subsequent years. So I'm going to try or attempt here to do a little bit of this virtually. And I do have, and we'll share this too, I do have a video that I took here just a week ago, actually. So the plants are a little bit small, but a video that we can, we'll share, that you can kind of look at some of this in a live setting, so to speak, and see some of it a little bit better maybe than I can show in a still image. But I'm going to jump right in and look at a few pictures and think about what we're talking about here. So with doing stand assessments on soybeans versus corn is a little bit differently. So with soybeans, when we do stand counts, a lot of times we do not do 17 feet 5 inches. Again, check with your employer to make sure or whoever you're working for to know how they want them done. But if you're doing a stand count on 17 feet 5 inches for 30-inch row soybeans, now you're maybe counting 100 to 140, 150, 200 plants in that row length. So it can take a little bit more time. So a lot of times what I recommend is counting 3 feet or 4 feet a row, counting the number of plants in that row length, dividing it by 4, and then I have a table, and the table then a number of those references that extrapolates number of beans per foot out to number of plants per acre. And so that's one of the things that I'm wanting to illustrate with this is you can really see why I say don't do just a 12-inch segment, because if you do that, that first segment is not going to have very many beans in it compared to that third segment, from 24 to 36. There's a wide variability if you're just counting a single foot for getting an estimate. So try to count at least 3 or 4 feet of row length to be able to estimate beans per foot. The other thing that this image does a pretty good job of on the soybean side is it shows a range of emergence that's occurring out there. So now I'm thinking of the emergence uniformity aspect of doing stand assessments. You have plants that are just coming out of the ground here at like 8 inches or at the 1-inch mark. But then if you go to the 17, 18, 19-inch mark, all of a sudden you have plants that have those unifoliates all the way unrolled already, right? So we have a pretty wide range of emergence that's occurring in this section here. And so that's one of the keys to think of as far as emergence uniformity. The other key is what is the spacing through the row? And so as we look at this one, this row length that I've got measured out, we have a couple plants that are, an inch apart, and then we have 2-inch gap or 3-inch gap, and then another inch, and then a big gap, and then we have, some close gaps, right? So the key here is, why do we have these gaps, right? And so one of the things that we can do is we can pop open that seed furrow, and we can look and see, is there a seed there? Is there a plant that just has not emerged yet? That type of thing. We can also look to see if there was a seed there or a seedling that died before it had emerged. And then if we have no seeds there at all, then we come back and we would assume that we have some planter performance issues. So were we just not getting good seed drop for, you name the reason with that. You can also dig up these areas where we have a growth stage difference, and you can say, well, why do we have a growth stage difference? So if you dig them up, and the soybeans that are further along were at a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 inch seed depth, versus the ones that are just emerging are down at 1.5 inches or 2 inches, that could explain that difference there. So I should also note that soybeans tend to have a wider time frame of emergence than corn. Soybeans are also much more tolerant of non-uniform spacings than corn is as well. And so that's one of the things to consider as you're walking out there. You can use it as an indicator of, how well was the planter working? Did we have, certain conditions at planting and after planting that may have altered that emergence uniformity? But you can also need to keep in mind that soybeans are just going to emerge over a longer time frame than corn typically will. Again, just showing an emerged soybean versus some that are clearly have been emerged for several days type thing. So there can be some differences out there. I do like to point out that soybeans will emerge through corn residue. In this situation, you can kind of see the row goes at a diagonal. Heavy corn residue is how I would refer this. The planter was not using a double disc, was not using row cleaners or a fluted coulter to process any of that residue. This was just that double disc opener planting the soybeans. And so you will get emergence through there. It will be a little bit more variable than if it's a clean tilled field. And this is a situation where you're probably going to want to do stand assessments closer to the V1, V2, V3 time frame, just because of some of the emergence variability that you can see with soybeans into a no-till or a heavy residue situation like this. On the corn side, I got a series of these pictures that I'm going to show you rather than a 17 feet, 5-inch row length. But again, we're looking for the same things. As we just talked about on the soybean side of it, we're looking for how many plants do we have out there, what is the estimation of the plant population, and then after I do those counts, I usually walk back down the row and I start to assess that emergence uniformity. So do we have good spacing or not? So the top picture of these corn plants, we have basically 2 pairs of plants that are have pretty good spacing, and then we have in the middle where I would call we probably have a miss occurring. Okay, so again, we can pop open that seed furrow to see, is there a seed there or a plant that did not emerge, or was there no seed drop? Because that can come back to estimating, was it a planter performance issue, or were there some biotic issues that came into play there? The bottom picture, obviously we have some plants that are V1 to V2 staging, but then we have that one plant there that is still at the VE stage or the emergent stage. So the question here is why did that plant emerge so much later? In this situation, if I remember when I took these pictures adequately enough, we had a cold stretch following planting, and so we could have some cold injury on the seed that affected this seed with just being weaker than the other seeds, and so it had delayed germination, delayed emergence on it. So we can look at that and see some of those differences. If it's one plant in that row length, is probably not a huge concern or a huge issue, but maybe something to make note of. If it occurs much more frequently, that is definitely something to make note of, so we can make improvements on the next year. And then we can also make some assessments on, based on the frequency of that delayed emergence and the degree of that delay, then we can start to assess, are there yield impacts that we should be accounting for? Do we need to start considering, our replant situation there? Skipping on, the top one, again, we have, a plant that's just emerging versus a couple on either side of it that have emerged, a stage and a half earlier, right? And so one of the things to think about, these two outside plants are definitely going to be stronger, more vibrant plants than that center one. And so we want to be recognizing some of those things. Getting close to my time here, but I want to show you a demonstration, and it's also in the video, of popping open that seed furrow to investigate what's going on in the seed furrow, if we have missing plants or delayed emergence, things like that. So as Andy mentioned, my favorite spade is a flat bottom spade as well. Setting it 2 to 3 inches off the row, you can press it in and then gently pull it back to start to pull open that seed furrow. In this first one that I showed you, you can definitely see that I got the seed furrow opened. Unfortunately, the plant was more closely attached to the other wall of the seed furrow, and so we don't see much there. The last one here I'll show, popping it open. I use my hand to help break open both sides of that seed furrow, or pull them both over. And what you can see is that there's the seed right there in the middle, and you can measure down that seed to be able to get a good seed depth. But you can also look for the radical roots and the seminal roots to be able to see some of those things. So in this picture here, what I'm illustrating is the bottom of the seed furrow being roughly 1.25 to 2 inches. When you look at where that seed was placed, now we're, something around 1.25 to maybe 1 inch there as well. So you can see that, and then you can see down in here, you can see the beginnings of the radical roots and those seminal roots. You can see those popping out. So you can see and identify sidewall compaction, if there's any root growth restrictions that may cause some bigger issues down the road. So with that, I'm going to skip ahead and put up my contact information if you do want to contact me about stand assessments or staging, and then open it back up if you have any questions for me here.
Hey, Mark, I have a few questions that I've collected. One of the questions was actually about where to find a table to extrapolate soybeans per foot of row to per acre, and I actually shared an ICM article that had that in there. I have had a few questions about corn being 2 collars or leaf stages behind. You'll see a significant yield difference due to uneven growth. And does that theory apply to soybeans as well when they have uneven growth and are at different stages?
So yeah, if you have corn that's at different growth stages or emergence dates, essentially, yeah, you can definitely have impacts on yield. Part of it depends on how close they are to the neighboring plant. So if it's a situation where you have a double, where you have one plant and another plant, 1 inch away, and those are 2 stages apart, the shorter plant, or the plant that's behind, becomes essentially a weed. It's going to be a dominated plant and may not produce at all. But if it's 3 to 5, 6 inches apart from other plants, it will still produce, but maybe not as much. Now, I think the other part of your question was going back into soybeans, and does it matter as much? Definitely not. So emergence timing on soybean, I'm not nearly as worried about as I am plant-to-plant spacing. I think trying to get those even spacings are more critical than making sure you have soybeans emerging on the same date. at the same point, I'm probably not as concerned if we have, a number of 2, 3, 4 or 5 inch gaps. I get more concerned when I have plant spacing gaps of 12 to 24 inches or something in that range, because those can have more of an impact on yield than, having the shorter gaps.
Okay. Another question is, how much frost damage is the Extension office seeing this year?
That's a good question for Angie. So yeah, some of the reports, or even Megan if she's still around, some of the reports that I'm hearing, it's much more prevalent north of Highway 20 here in Iowa. I have seen a little bit here in central Iowa on leaf margins, or a plant here or there type thing, but I'm not seeing the, so to speak, a uniform impact from frost here in the central Iowa area. I think there may be east central and maybe even down into southeast Iowa, there may have been a little bit more frost injury as well than we have here. So I see Angie popped her screen on, so maybe she'll help elaborate a little bit more.
I would agree with you, and the frost injury is pretty variable, right? So I've noticed we have more frost injury on corn in low-lying areas. So where both of the exposed leaves were totally damaged, right? They've turned brown, they're going to slough off, but the new growth is there. I mean, it honestly, so I went out and looked on Tuesday. I waited a couple of days until after the Saturday morning frost, and I'm going to go back out this afternoon and look at some of those plants again, but new growth was coming. The soybeans is very, very variable, in, at least in my experience. You'll have perfectly fine plants, and then you'll have plants where the cotyledons are definitely dead, and the and they were open, and even the ones that were closed, the interior, so what would be the unifoliates would also, they appear dead. But I have a bunch of plants flagged, and I'm going to go out and look again today or tomorrow, or maybe when the sun comes out. I think it's important to wait a few days, right, to get that true assessment. And there are places that had frost or got even colder than what we'd call a normal frost, more like a freeze. And then there are places that didn't have that. So it's very variable out there.
Thanks, Angie. Another question was about expected stand losses if you planted at standard planting population. So for example, in corn, if you planted at 35,000 plants per acre, seeds per acre, or 140,000 seeds per acre in soybeans, what percentage should we expect to actually grow?
So the standard extension answer is it depends. So let me explain that a little bit. So the first thing you have to factor in is what is the seed germination on the bag. So if it says 95%, then you should probably not expect more than 95%. Okay, that's and that seed germination on the bag is a worm germ test most of the time. And so then you have to also factor in, what are the soil conditions after planting and up to emergence, right? So if you're into a harsher condition, colder, wetter soils, you should expect a higher loss rate. So generally what I talk about as far as what you should maybe expect on corn is something around 90%. Give or take, and again, it's going to depend on what the germination percentage on the tag is. You may even get down to you may even get down to 85%. So 85 to 90% is something that you might expect on corn. On soybeans, cracking of that seed can happen a little bit more commonly. A lot of times the germination on soybean seed is not quite as high as corn either. And so I generally am talking about somewhere in the 80 to 90% germination rates, or, from seeding rate down to what do you have emerged out of the ground, again, being something around that 80 to 90% on soybeans.
Thanks, Mark. And the final question we have is, talk Dr. Bilo at the University of Illinois has said that 20-inch row corn and 40 to 44,000 population is the way of the future for producing 300 bushel corn. What are your thoughts on that?
I have not seen convincing evidence that we're going to get 300 bushel corn out of 20-inch rows as of right now. I have done some row spacing work over the years, looking at 20-inch rows versus 30-inch rows. One of my findings was that 20-inch rows are not negatively impacting yield. So you can move down into 20-inch rows and get the same yield as 30-inch rows pretty consistently. Now, when I took my data set and I spliced it for what I termed high yielding versus low yielding, and that break point is somewhere around 240, 250 bushels per acre, the response to 20-inch rows started to become positive. Okay. At the same point, I did not have any of my sites or treatments did I have 20-inch rows that got up to 300 bushels. Again, I think there's some other management that we have to consider, you know, if we're really wanting to get into the 300 bushel per acre range. It's going to be more than just looking at row spacing. But I do think as we get into higher producing fields and field areas, that's where we will likely see some of the benefits from the 20-inch rows.
Thanks, Mark. We got one more question in asking about people planting at 160 to 180,000 populations for soybeans. Are they planting too much?
Yeah, so again, the data that we have available to us right now would suggest that we should be seeding around 125 to 140,000 seeds per acre. Our goal here is to attain 100,000 plants per acre at the end of the year. The data that we have is indicating that that 100,000 plants per acre at the end of the year is where we're optimizing or maximizing our yield. And so there may be some situations where we want to bump up to 160 or 180,000 if we have some tough field conditions. You know, that might be knocking back plant populations, things like that. But one of the things that we're starting to see a little bit of as we've looked at variable rate seeding is in our higher producing areas, there may be some opportunity to lower seeding rates just because those areas were generally not losing as much from an emergence rate standpoint. And we're able to get more pods per plant on those, and they're able to support more pods per plant in the higher producing areas. In areas that we have some biotic issues going on, so if we have sudden death syndrome or soybean cyst nematodes, even if we have some iron chlorosis deficiency, those areas, because we tend to have less biomass produced, that might be areas where we see a benefit from increasing that seeding rate to maybe 160 or 180,000 on soybeans.